Welcome, everyone. On the spirit of you all being here on time, we're going to go ahead and get started. Just to go over real fast, my name is Scott Hassett. Welcome to the OpsMX webinar today. Your presenter today is Bob Gould, Robert, and I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation and interaction you can have with him. And the rules that we just kind of want to follow is use the chat if you have a specific question. And we'll have follow-up, and throughout we're going to ask you a couple of questions for a poll just to get some more insight to help Bob do a little bit better job of make sure he's customizing his thoughts and conversation in your best interest. And just a last heads up, this is being recorded, which will be available later for your viewing pleasure. And with that in mind, let me turn it over to Robert.
Excellent. Thanks, Scott. I really appreciate that. Thanks for the generous introduction. Guys, so what I want to do, sort of as we go through this, is, and by the way, just to sort of summarize what we're going to be talking about today, I do this presentation from time to time to really sort of talk to people about where OpsMX brings value as it relates to using Spinnaker as the CD tool within their organization. There are a lot of benefits. There's a lot of things that we're doing to sort of build on top of the overall sort of experience, and from a feature function perspective, sort of working through to sort of fill some of those gaps at an enterprise level that would really sort of help from a visibility and from a security and compliance perspective. But so some of the presentation here is going to be about that today, but I'm also going to interweave something that I think is really exciting, right? I think one of the things that I think is always comes up when we talk about Spinnaker and we talk about implementing Spinnaker, especially for some of our sort of mid-market customers, right? So those young growing software organizations, or some of those enterprises even that don't have a lot of folks sort of involved in their DevOps process. It's a growing practice within their organization. The exciting part there is OpsMX has decided to offer Spinnaker and its entire stack as a SaaS offering. And this way here, you simply become a consumer of that goodness. And so I want to walk you through today, some of the benefits of OpsMX over just sort of open source Spinnaker, talk to you a little bit about our SaaS offering, and then we'll get into the product itself. My presentations tend to be lighter on the slideware and more hands-on, and so we'll go hands-on. But before I go there, just a little bit about OpsMX, just for those of you that might not be familiar. So, our goal, and it is a very lofty one, is to deliver software without human intervention. And you'll see that theme throughout sort of what I present today, and sort of as we go to the hands-on demo portions, you'll start to see where we're building toward that vision. And that doesn't mean, by the way, compromise in any way. It means helping with automation so that you don't have to compromise as it relates to your software release process. Our products are twofold. We've got a product called Autopilot, which is that sort of command and control layer that we'll talk about, and then OpsMX Enterprise for Spinnaker. Again, both available as a SaaS offering, as we'll walk through today. And then I think no presentation would be complete without us sort of maybe crowing a little bit about some of our success stories, right? And so some of our global customers include the likes of Cisco and Salesforce, Indeed, Symphony. We're very proud of these relationships because we really feel like with each one of these, we were able to partner with our customer and ultimately help them reach those CD goals and really sort of help them get to a place where software delivery as a practice within their organization was more mature than before they met us, right? And that's done through a combination of tooling and some of our expertise, right? And so we're really excited here today to sort of talk to you a little bit about sort of what we're doing and sort of walk you through that. So let me go ahead and jump in. So a little bit about Spinnaker, if you're not aware, right? So Spinnaker in its background really was initially developed internally at Netflix. And ultimately, what they were doing was looking for a way that they could deliver software at scale. And ultimately, came through and said, we're a sort of multinational, multi-cloud, multi-target organization. So we have to build something that's ultimately going to allow us to do that or meet those needs of somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 deployments a day. And then ultimately, once they've done that, they turned around and the engineering leadership there within Netflix went ahead and said, geez, we could really do a lot of good by taking this and open sourcing it. And so ultimately it became Spinnaker as an open source project. Now the open source project is extremely robust. That includes folks like OpsMX, along with others in the community that are really sort of making sure that this stays a vibrant community. You're getting the benefits of that open source nature, right? So open source software obviously is driven by a cross section of really smart people when it comes to development. And you can see as it's evolved over the years to go from, sort of something that was, sort of really tailored for some of the Netflix, sort of use cases to now broadening out and, multi-cloud CD platform. So whether it be, no matter where you are, I should say, on that sort of digital transformation journey from, say a monolithic application to sort of a more microservices, type of architecture, Spinnaker has adapted, with the recent release of Keel within Spinnaker, announcing making those progressive delivery options easier, right? And so doing some of those things that really you're using an open source tool because you're getting that level of sort of cutting edge, and ultimately making sure that that large and vibrant community is ultimately delivering on sort of where the market's going. And so we're really excited and really proud to be partnered with the Spinnaker community, and ultimately being able to help some of those enterprise customers fill some of those gaps in terms of feature functions, whereas Spinnaker is focused on that sort of core CD. And so that's something that we're really proud of. In terms of Spinnaker features, delivery pipelines, again, automating your deployment workflows. Again, you're really looking to make it easy to get from sort of the fingertips of your developers or the whiteboard in your conference room where software is being designed all the way through to a deployment, right? And I think that being able to create those pipelines and being able to orchestrate all of the tools in your tool chain, right? So whether you're using Jenkins or Travis or some other CI tool, and if you're using Artifactory or Nexus, or you're using ECR, or you're deploying to a serverless environment, or again you're doing a build, bake, deploy type of scenario, Spinnaker is going to support all that and orchestrate all that for you. It supports the multi-cloud deployments, right? So AWS, Azure, GCP, all of the major cloud providers, the Oracle Cloud, other cloud providers as well. And then, obviously, being able to automate releases, right? So being able to trigger Spinnaker based on commits, being able to monitor CI jobs, being able to ultimately be triggered by anything that can emit a webhook, really gives the tool a lot of flexibility. And OpsMX has come in over the top and built on top of that, right? So we've brought in the Terraform integrations, we've brought in the change management, the Jenkins, or I'm sorry, the Jira, the ServiceNow integrations, so that you can ultimately really sort of plan for Spinnaker to sort of be that centerpiece of their DevOps toolchain and act as that large scale orchestrator. And so that's something that's really exciting. And as we're going to talk about a little bit later, we take all that flexibility and we take all that extensibility, and we can eliminate the need for any of the operational overhead that goes along with a tool like that by offering it through our SaaS offering. So, really, what I wanted to talk about today and make sure that we mentioned is this concept of the OpsMX intelligent cloud. And those of you familiar with my presentations, I usually like to start off with real basic, sort of definitions of what something is. And, I think if you think about, sort of what intelligent cloud, OpsMX intelligent cloud is, it's really us encapsulating both the Autopilot stack, which is that add-on to Spinnaker that sits on top of Spinnaker and creates that visibility for you. It creates or allows for the security and safe deployments. It adds that continuous verification that just goes beyond metrics. And then we combine that with Spinnaker, all in a cloud-based or SaaS offering. And so we allow you to go ahead and ultimately, sort of deploy, or we'll deploy this for you, so that there's no sort of maintenance and upkeep, right? So there's no, sort of, I need to upgrade Spinnaker, or do I need to upgrade the Autopilot stack? We handle all of that for you, while providing you with the flexibility of still being able to interact with all of your Kubernetes clusters or all of your other tools in your tool chain that happen to sit behind your firewall, while also allowing your developers to continue to use things like pipelines as code. And so we're going to analyze or look at all those things today. But really, that sort of deployment modality of using this as a SaaS offering is something that we find incredibly exciting, because it unlocks the power of this tool, or this CD stack, for a lot more people and for a lot more organizations who, maybe are in a situation where, taking on the operational overhead of a CD tool right now is a little too much, and they just want something more turnkey. So let's go into some of the details. One of the things I like to do is sort of establish that baseline around, sort of, because I think that the question that's always in folks' head is, why wouldn't I just use open source Spinnaker? It's out there, it's free. I get support, so sure, right? But let's talk a little bit about some of the details around sort of why you might consider, sort of OpsMX. And then, obviously, one of the big draws is that SaaS piece, right? But let's talk in a little bit more detail about some of the other reasons, right? And so, one of the things about, sort of Spinnaker is, there is a degree of difficulty here, right, in terms of, sort of the install and, configuring your infrastructure, right, and making sure that that's all set up. Mostly, for the most part, it's, when we say only on-prem, it's really self-managed, right? There isn't some open source version of Spinnaker that you can just start using, right? You're going to need to manage it yourself. That's what we mean by only on-prem. Whereas with OpsMX, we have the entire stack that we've got a Helm chart, a very rich Helm chart that allows you to configure all the parameters that you need, allows you to go ahead and do things like making sure that you're securing the installation, that you're using, the appropriate secrets like Vault to store secrets, all within our Helm chart. And it's really a simple one command to install Spinnaker and OES. We offer, things like the lifecycle management piece. And so, if you are, sort of choosing to manage this on your own, the full GitOps model, right? And we actually deploy our SaaS offering in the exact same way, right? So we make upgrades easy, we make management easy through the GitOps model, and really allow you as the customer to ultimately, sort of have access to that information as well, even in the Spinnaker as a service, sort of process. And so, ultimately we're working to sort of reduce the day one operation difficulties around installation and getting set up. And then obviously over the top, we bring our expertise, right? So, one of the things that's daunting about sort of any of these types of projects is I look at something like Spinnaker, I'm enamored with the feature set, but, with extensibility and flexibility comes some level of complexity. And so I want to mitigate that. And so, either using Spinnaker as a service through OpsMX, or partnering with OpsMX to ultimately help you install and get yourself up and running on Spinnaker really are options that are very attractive to our customers. Then we start looking at day two operations, right? So, onboarding cloud providers and, how to create complex pipelines, the security management piece of this, and then ultimately any hiccups that come along with ultimately integrating some of your other CI or DevOps toolchain tools. What you're going to see during my demo is, again, that ease of account onboarding, whether it's, using a UI versus having to go in and sort of dive around in a Halyard config file, or going through and actually deploying an agent. In our SaaS model, we have an agent that ultimately can deploy to be deployed to a Kubernetes cluster, or behind your firewall. So if you're a Jenkins server and your Travis server or your Artifactory server are sitting behind your firewall, we don't want to have to ask you to sort of poke holes in that to be able to access those things. We'll walk through sort of how you can do that with our SaaS instance, through an agent. The enterprise security model, again, using RBAC and being able to leverage, sort of the authorization and authentication pieces that you've already got in place. Pod to pod, communication through MTLS, and then ultimately vault-based secret management, right? So that's all built right into our tool, whether you're using it, from a SaaS perspective, or if you just choose to deploy it in your VPC. And then pre-built adapters for the majority of the tools that are in your DevOps toolchain. So again, the idea behind this is to harness the power of Spinnaker, and to make it just easier, right? To make it simpler for you as a customer, to be able to make it so that you can get on board with something like Spinnaker and start to recognize the power of that tool without having to go through and worry about some of the items here as part of those day 2 operations. And then, some of the day 3 operations, or what we call the day 3 operations, how do you make Spinnaker production ready? Let's face it, right? I mean, I think, the idea behind this is that, if you were to invest in Spinnaker and sort of choose that as a CD tool of choice, you have to be prepared for the fact now that this is going to be in the critical path, right? And so, some of our larger enterprises out there that are using Spinnaker have had to invest the time in making that happen, right? And so we want to help you short circuit that, right? We want to be able to offer you the ability to say, hey, here's a blueprint for setting up the HA architecture, or hey, if it suits you, use our SaaS offering and don't worry about an HA architecture. We'll worry about it. And so that's something that I think is very attractive for a lot of our customers who want to, again, tap into the power of Spinnaker without that operational overhead. I think, deploying into multiple clusters with our OES agent, again, that's something we're going to walk through as part of the hands-on demo. The ability to go ahead and ultimately deploy those agents and control permissions around those agents, so that they can, make these things, or make these Kubernetes clusters targets for either your self-hosted or SaaS-based Spinnaker. We make that very, very simple. And then we'll talk a little bit about our integration with things like policy enforcement, or the ability to go ahead and actually leverage policies and decision gates to ultimately go ahead and enhance the security of the software that's being deployed. And then, talk to you a little bit about things like pipelines as code. So we're going to cover that as well. And all of these are options that you can tap into using our SaaS-based offering as well. And so again, the idea behind this is that we want to bring you that sort of world-class, continuous delivery tool without some of the overhead that's associated with maintaining that. And so this is, again, something that we're really excited about. And again, we started talking about some of the key features earlier that OpsMX can bring to the table. Things like manual approval gates. And if we look at those within Spinnaker right now, they're there, right? But they're not really data driven, right? I can put in a manual approval gate, and I can type a small paragraph and set, whether it's accept or reject, or approve or reject. But they're not really data driven gates. You have to rely on the human being to read what you want them to go look at, hope that they go look at it, and then come back, right? And so we've taken a very different approach to this. On the whole, Spinnaker lacks auditing, right? While Spinnaker is very powerful from the perspective of it's not a fire and forget type tool. Those of you that are familiar with doing CD with something like Groovy scripts and other glue code, with Jenkins, right? Recognize the fact that, it's sort of a fire and forget type of scenario, and you don't get any sort of insights. Well, Spinnaker is going to provide those insights, and we'll take a look at that, sort of as I go through the demo. But it does lack that auditing piece, right? So that ability to go ahead and say, hey, I need to do a postmortem, or I need to prove to an auditor that this pipeline ran and was compliant with separation of duties protocols, because there was somebody that sort of committed the code, and a different person from a different group was actually responsible for approving. And it also lacks some of the dashboarding features, right? And so we'll sort of walk through some of those as well. And these are our attempts to sort of take Spinnaker and sort of add that enterprise layer on top of it, right? And sort of really make this viable for that enterprise. Without you, I mean, obviously, some customers and some users of Spinnaker have decided, hey, let me go try and it's open source, so let me try and build this stuff on top of that, right? And I think, our customer base has said to us, yeah, we need something that's a little bit more turnkey, but we also need these gaps filled. And that's something that I think is really important here when you're looking at, sort of using a CD tool like Spinnaker. So let's go hands-on with the product. I think, again, I want to make sure that, we're not just looking at slides here. And so typically what I like to do is really sort of dig in and sort of show you sort of what the product looks like. Now, again, I'm going to start off by going through, some of our setup features, but I think, the idea behind this is this is this can be run as a SaaS offering. So it's not required. You certainly are able to set this up and deploy it within your own tenant. But I think for those of you that are out there that are looking for something turnkey, you'll notice a lot of the features that we've put together here really lend themselves nicely to a SaaS offering. And so, when I look at things like setup to begin with, I come over to, sort of my cloud providers piece, and we'll come back to the integrations in just a moment. But when I look at the cloud provider piece, I want to look at sort of how do I go about setting up the various targets, right? Now, for those of you that are familiar with Spinnaker and understand sort of how it works, that a lot of this is, sort of execing into the Halyard pod and ultimately following their documentation to go ahead and sort of set up these various accounts. Whereas what OpsMX is attempting to do is really sort of do that Halyard extraction, right? So we make this all sort of a UI-based scenario. And so, I can come in here and I can start to create accounts. And as you can see here, we're starting with some of the more common ones, right? So I can create a Kubernetes account. I can create an AWS or Azure or GCP account here, and ultimately use the information here to sort of fill out the form and ultimately provide the data necessary for this to be added to Spinnaker. And then sort of once that's done, I simply synchronize the accounts and we'll go ahead and actually run behind the scenes the HAL deploy apply and ultimately synchronize those accounts with Spinnaker. And ultimately, securing all that information in a Vault instance that we've set up as part of our process of deploying this stuff. So this is, sort of part one. And from our perspective, this is sort of that work in progress, right? So we started with some of the low-hanging fruit here, and we're continuing to expand our horizon in terms of those cloud provider type of scenarios that you can deploy right here through our UI. Now, the other piece of this is some of the integrations, right? Now, there's, sort of this integration piece here. And I'm going to talk about the agent here in just a moment. But, if we were to look at the integration pieces here, again, as part of that sort of Halyard extraction, we're looking to add, some of the artifact repositories here, some of the CI tools here, the monitoring tools, as we're going to talk a little bit about continuous verification later, sort of how can I do continuous verification in relation to progressive deliveries or safe deliveries. Some of our governance or change management systems like ServiceNow and Jira. So the point here is that, again, I don't need access to the Halyard pod in a SaaS scenario. I can do a lot of this setup and configuration right through the Spinnaker or right through the OpsMX Autopilot UI, making this extremely easy to go ahead and set up and really, again, make you a consumer of this goodness versus a maintainer and someone that sets up this type of scenarios. The other piece of this that I want to talk about is the agent-based technology. Now, the agent technology today has two main uses. One is to ultimately be able to go ahead and actually create an agent and ultimately deploy that agent to a Kubernetes cluster and make that Kubernetes cluster now a target for that particular Spinnaker instance. And again, for those of you that are familiar with Spinnaker, there's a whole process that needs to take place in order to be able to do that, with Spinnaker out of the box. And so we're creating this agent that will facilitate secure communication between the Spinnaker instance and the Kubernetes cluster. The agent ultimately acts as a proxy, so we can transcend, bastion servers and firewalls without having to expose those things to the public internet in the event that you're running this as a SaaS offering. And ultimately configure that agent so that, again, it can serve up that Kubernetes cluster as a target to Spinnaker. We can control things like the namespaces that are available. We can control things like the groups from an RBAC perspective that would be able to interact with that particular agent. So all that is sort of locked down and configurable right from our UI. Now, when I go ahead and actually create this agent, what ultimately I end up doing is basically creating a manifest. That manifest ultimately, and let me see if I can make this a little bigger, because if you're like me, you are getting old and your eyesight is going. So we're ultimately creating this manifest that ultimately you'll simply deploy to that Kubernetes cluster that will ultimately create that service account. But the connectivity will be in a secure tunnel between Spinnaker and that Kubernetes cluster, and this agent will act as a proxy for Spinnaker in terms of performing those operations. And so we're really making it easy to onboard clusters in mass, right? So you don't have to worry about going around to these things and saying, hey, let me go get X, Y, or Z, and then ultimately come back to Spinnaker, log into Halyard, port that kube config file into Halyard, and then ultimately create that target. I can do all that by simply just deploying this manifest, and ultimately I can have a manifest that's deployable, per group, that defines permissions, from an RBAC perspective. So again, making this stuff easy to do is really about, again, and this is a term that I know we use internally, is how do we go from zero to awesome with Spinnaker in a very, very short period of time. And it's something that we're dedicated to, and it's something that we're, empowering technologies like this allow our customers to ultimately start to leverage things like our SaaS offering, which, without stuff like this can be tricky, right? Because if you have a SaaS offering and you have to start giving the customer access to the back end, that could be a little tricky, right? And so we want to make sure that you don't have to do that, just from an ease of use perspective. Now, the other piece of this that's exciting is, in the event that, let's say, as an example, you want to access things that are behind your corporate firewall. So I've got a Jenkins server back there. I've got an Artifactory server back there, but I'm using SaaS, right? The last thing I'm going to go do is try and convince my security team that they should expose these assets to the internet. You'll get laughed out of their office. It'll be a nice joke, and then you'll be forced to leave. And so one of the things that we've done is we've actually extended our agent so that, if you've got a Kubernetes instance running behind that firewall, or if you want to stand up a small proxy using K3S or something like that, you can then ultimately deploy the agent with this type of configuration, where we can start to go ahead and actually create scenarios where now I can use the agent as a proxy behind your firewall to get access to Jenkins and Artifactory or any of the other resources that are sitting behind there, without having to move them into the cloud, without having to punch holes in the firewall. Again, I can do all these things, and it's really simple to be able to go ahead and deploy this and ultimately add those assets, to my Spinnaker, which now allows me to go ahead and do things like, let me pull artifacts from that Artifactory. Let me trigger those Jenkins jobs from this cloud-based Spinnaker. So all of those things become or get unlocked for us by being able to do that. And, as you can see here, all of the different assets that you may have access to again, we can wire up that OpsMX agent to these things and ultimately, sort of make them work with our SaaS offering. Really, really powerful stuff, and doing it in an extremely secure way. And again, if we go all the way back to what's the point is I want access to a cutting edge CD tool, but boy, I just don't want all the overhead that's associated with it. And so this is, sort of one of those ways where we're able to provide those pieces for you. Now, the goodness doesn't stop there, right? I mean, if you think about we just talk about how one might set this up in a SaaS environment and still be able to access those resources. We haven't talked yet about, sort of unlocking, some of the real power of Spinnaker and some of the things that you can do. But I think it's also important to talk a little bit about, before I sort of dive into this, sort of the ways that you can continue to allow your development teams to work, right? So one of the questions I get all the time is, hey, Bob, this is great. I love all this, but I'm interested in, sort of allowing my developers to continue to work in a way that they're comfortable. So do you offer, sort of pipelines as code and sort of that GitOps model? And the answer is absolutely, right? So, if we were to look at, some of the things that we can do here, we can ultimately set up a repository here. This can be a private repository where I can set this up, and ultimately my developers, or in sort of a CD as a service model, each development team can sort of have their own repository where they have all of their pipelines listed out, right? And essentially what we're able to do is synchronize that SaaS instance of Spinnaker, or that self-managed instance of Spinnaker, with this repo, and ultimately allow you to go ahead, because every single pipeline that is deployed inside of Spinnaker is nothing more than a JSON file, right? And so the typical onboarding process for a lot of folks is, again, hey, let's understand sort of what are the table stakes for a pipeline within a different a distinct engineering group, and let's create some templates, and then ultimately make those templates available where I can sort of copy those and start to modify them, and then ultimately commit those pipelines. Ultimately they get synchronized up to Spinnaker, and then we also have a CLI which would allow you to go ahead and actually trigger those pipelines if there wasn't already a triggering event there. So there's a lot that I can do here as a developer to sort of make sure I'm living in the environment that I'm most comfortable with while interacting with this. And so, I wanted to point this out because this is available both, sort of in our self-managed, in our SaaS offering. And again, it's just another way that we make integrating Spinnaker into your process easier. Now, some of the other things, and just to change gears for a moment, that makes Spinnaker really powerful is, some of these complex workflows that I can set up, right? So I think there's a lot of folks that are out there that are saying to themselves, okay, I want to do, sort of progressive delivery, or rolling upgrades, or I want to do canary analysis, but God, I don't want to write the code that's associated with all these things and try and pull that off from, Jenkins, or pull it off from Travis. I'd like an orchestrator to be able to do that. And so I think this is really where Spinnaker and the OpsMX Autopilot combination really sort of helps you. So let's talk about that for a moment. This is a great example of a pipeline where I'm doing, sort of a progressive delivery, right? So here I'm deploying my new code to my targeted environment. Now, again, I took a shortcut here and was just putting my manifests in here. I can also call these manifests from wherever they're stored. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and deploy that. The next thing I want to do is I want to actually start the traffic shaping so that I can start to redirect some of the traffic toward this new code. And so I can start to go ahead and do that. Now I can use an ingress controller like Nginx ingress controller. If I'm using some other traffic shaping technology, I've recently worked with a customer who was using a traffic shaping technology from Amazon, right? And so Spinnaker is able to sort of handle all of that. But once I start to do that, I want to go ahead and validate that traffic, right? So I split 30% off. And before I go to the next stage in terms of this rollout, I want to do a validation. So one of the things that is, really sort of enhanced about, sort of that level of analysis is something that we're doing with our Autopilot stack. And so if we were to look here at sort of some of that, and let me just find, there we go. I can look at some of these analysis. Now I can inject these stages into my Spinnaker pipeline directly from the OpsMX UI. But when I'm doing a rolling upgrade like that, I want to call this traffic validation stage, and this will trigger an analysis. Now, we've gone in ahead of time and through the setup, wired up the log and metric sources that are being used, right? And of course, we understand the tags that are being used in those sort of log and metric aggregators so that we can isolate the traffic that's associated with this application. And what I'm doing during this validation stage is I'm looking at the logs and metrics while that 30% of the traffic has been steered toward the new code, and basically doing anomaly detection, right? So I'm looking at a log analysis and saying, hey, here's the list of logs that look anomalous to us. These are log clusters that we haven't seen before. They're unexpected in this particular context. And then ultimately, we've started to classify these things for you, whether or not we consider them warnings or errors or critical errors. We also do the same thing with metric analysis so that you can start the process of looking at a key set of metrics. Those metrics could be coming from Prometheus, they could be coming from Datadog, App Dynamics, doesn't matter to us. We can sort of wire that up. And then ultimately, what we're doing here is creating a score, a confidence score at each stage along the way. So whether I want to automate this and saying, look, the confidence score has to be between 100 and 95 in order for it to automatically move forward, or if I want to stop the pipeline and have someone come in and actually look at this, I can certainly do that as well. But the idea behind this is that for each step along the way, I'm performing that continuous verification. And I'm ultimately going ahead and ultimately looking for those anomalies in both the logs and metrics. And I can do that right on down the line here. By the way, the other thing that I can do is I can use some of the conditional expressions here to roll back. And so let's say if at any point along the way, this thing were to fail, the validation were to fail, I could consider that an atomic error and ultimately roll this pipe, use this to roll this entire thing back. So to take that green deployment and ultimately roll it back and undo the traffic shaping. So again, this stuff can all be sort of orchestrated right through Spinnaker. And the idea behind this, guys, again, is I want to show you the power of the tool. And also, I keep going back to the SaaS offering. You don't have to, sort of do a ton of setup and configuration to make this work. Partnering with OpsMX, again, that 0 to awesome, or that, sort of 0 to live in a very, very short period of time, so that you're starting to see value like this, that, you're not going to get if you go with a tool that is downloaded, installed, and you're just, sort of let us know if anything breaks. We take a vested interest in that level of success that you're seeing. And so one of those features of OES combined with, or Autopilot combined with, the power of Spinnaker is something that I always like to highlight there from that perspective. Now, the other thing that I want to mention, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the Autopilot features before we wrap up, is that multi-cloud or multi-target aspect of Spinnaker. So Spinnaker is also really by most considered a transitional tool. For most customers that haven't gone to a microservices architecture, or have simply decided, look, there are certain applications that are in my sort of stack that, from a lifecycle management perspective, they're never going to get to microservices. And so I need something that can handle all of this. And so, we've got such a tight integration with all the cloud providers that our ability to do things like, trigger a Jenkins job to ultimately build new code, and then ultimately take that resulting artifact and bake a new image, or in this case here, a new AMI for Amazon, and bake that code into that image, and then ultimately deploy that image, right? So again, sort of defining, and here I can define, sort of all the elements of that deployment right here. And so giving you the ability to go ahead and actually do that and use that sort of multi-target piece and really doesn't matter to us sort of what type of deployment you're doing. We give you all that power to ultimately go ahead and actually manage both sides or multiple types of deployments. It's the same thing with a lot of the serverless technology. So, if you're using something like App Engine, again, easy for Spinnaker to be able to deploy code to an App Engine via pipeline to an App Engine setup. So we can ultimately do that as well. So I think here, again, we're showcasing sort of, or highlighting, some of those things that are extremely powerful about the tool. When you look at this thing, and again, partnering with someone like OpsMX or using our SaaS offering and partnering with us, we can get you to that place where we can start to retire some of those scripts, some of those groovy scripts, or some of that glue code that you're using to try and string together these things. The other thing I mentioned when we were talking earlier is sort of this idea of using CI to do CD, and those things sort of being fire and forget. One of the things you get with Spinnaker here is, again, that visibility into sort of what's deployed, where it's deployed, and then ultimately being able to sort of interact with it, right? So, I can ultimately interact with a replica set here. I can ultimately decide to undo a rollout. So if I wanted to sort of undo something, I could do it right from here, right? It's easy. If I click on this, it'll ask me, sort of what revision do I want to roll back to, and ultimately it'll handle it for me. Or if I want to look specifically at a pod and look at sort of editing that pod, or if I want to look at the log output from that pod, I can do all those things right from here. And so again, this tool has, I guess, for lack of a better term, has a relationship with your environment. It's not just a fire and forget. And so the other piece of this, I think, that's also important, and I think this is a nice place to sort of transition into some of the Autopilot features here, are sort of our ability to piggyback on top of Spinnaker to start to provide some of those things that are going to allow you to help manage security, auditing and logging, the efficacy of your releases, and the ability to actually have some command and control over these things. And so when we look at things like approval gates, and this here is an approval gate that's designed in the Autopilot UI and then is injected into a Spinnaker pipeline. But here I can define things like, who are the potential approvers? What groups are those made up of? Right? This gets me to my separation of duties, right? I no longer have a developer with a direct line to production, right? I can put this gate in here. But I also gather up the needed information to sort of make this decision, right? And again, because we have this agent-based technology, you can leverage this using our SaaS offering. You don't have to worry about sort of taking your Jenkins system or your, sort of, if you've got a private Git system or something along those lines behind the firewall, you don't have to worry about that. So again, we're doing this and making this easy in terms of gating things. Now, the other types of gates we can inject here are things like policy gates. So if I were to look at, sort of compliance and policy, I can start the process of defining or putting up guardrails around where certain pipelines can deploy. I can put up guardrails around, hey, let's go check those black duck results, make sure they're in line with what we're expecting before we allow this pipeline to run. And I can start to automate some of those decisions through that policy piece. The other piece of this is around audit, right? So if you're a recently public company, or if you are somebody that wants to make sure that you have a path to postmortem, or understanding of sort of what happened and when, we're going to provide you with an audit trail for every single pipeline execution. Any pipeline that gets changed, we're logging that. Every audit check that's done, we're logging that as well. And so this really provides the ability to really give the efficacy of any given release. And I can also put it in context. If I were to look at my application dashboard for a moment and click on those deployments, here's each one of the environments as defined inside of Spinnaker. And then here's what's deployed there. And if I want to look at any of these things and see, how did this release get here? What were the decision trees, or what was the data that was evaluated? and who approved it ultimately, right? So who approved the promotion of this thing to this particular spot, right? And so again, I get that sort of command and control. I get that layer that allows me to go ahead and make sure that you know, we're really tight on, you know, sort of making sure that we're following those processes and procedures. We're putting up guardrails for our developers, but we're obfuscating the need to worry about those guardrails for the developers, right? Developers don't like to have a bunch of you know, I guess you could call them policies foisted upon them. They just want to do their job and worry about downstream systems making sure that if they make a mistake or if there's a problem, that, you know, it will get caught there. And so that's really what we're doing here, is making sure that that is possible, and to sort of streamline the developer, to ultimately give our security folks and our DevSecOps folks all windows into what's happening within our environments. And again, guys, I think, you know, at risk of sort of beating a dead horse, all this is available in sort of a turnkey SaaS offering, which is tremendously exciting, at least from my perspective, because I can, you know, again, get from zero to awesome very, very quickly. So, guys, that's the, you know, I look at the time here. We're coming up on time, and so I want to stop there, and hopefully, you know, this was interesting and it was something that you were able to get, you know, a bit out of, in terms of sort of what it means to work with OpsMX and sort of how we can help you further some of those CD goals. And, you know, ultimately, we want to make sure that if you have any questions or concerns, you certainly feel free to ask them now. But I also want to put up, you know, info@opsmx.com. Folks will go ahead and actually, you know, sort of send that stuff over to me, and I'll certainly answer your questions. If you want a more detailed demo session, or if you just want to get together and talk about your situation and sort of see what we think, get a different set of ears or eyes on your current situation, please don't be shy about reaching out to us. We're certainly happy to help there. So let me stop there and turn it back over to Scott. I know you put another set of questions up for folks. Scott, any questions on the chat that that might be maybe I could answer now, or do we want to just maybe get those offline?
There aren't any questions at the moment, but please, if you wish to have either more information, a presentation, or just a conversation back and forth with Bob, please let us know, and we'll be happy to do that. Before we wrap it up, is there any questions from anyone that they wish to ask right now? Well, I thank you for your time, Bob. A pleasure to listen to you. I hope everyone enjoyed it. And again, if you need more information, reach out to this information here or real fast on the poll, and we'll make sure we follow up with that. Bob, any closing comments from you?
No, none from me, guys, other than to say thank you for coming. And like I said, hopefully you found it useful, and looking forward to talking to you offline. And hopefully, I always enjoy discussing you know, new and interesting CD issues. So please don't be shy about reaching out to us.
Yeah, and good luck with your implementations. Hopefully you're looking at Spinnaker and thinking about that. But if you need any questions along the way, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.